This is Clark the Knife, and this is the Birdvis Hitchcock, the titanium production version. And this is a little bit more of a first impressions than a full review, because I haven't owned and carried this knife for quite as long as I typically do prior to a review. But I am so darn excited about this knife that I can't help myself from getting something up more quickly. This knife looks basic and might even look unimpressive, especially for the price, which is pretty steep. And it might not be what you would expect from Birdvis if you know the company, but it is insanely well executed and does everything you would want in a production knife, as well as anything I've handled in quite some time. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. I'm not here to waste your time, so let's go right into the background and specs of this knife here. Birdvis Knives is a one-man shop founded and run by Nick Timpson in Northern California. He's around Sacramento, founded in 2017. And over the past 7, almost 8 years, Nick has made a name for himself by making extraordinarily refined, often downright beautiful, custom slip joints. Everyday Commentaries, Anthony Scullambrini, who's one of my favorite reviewers, has long sung Nick's praises, as has Nick Shabazz and a few other relatively prominent reviewers all across the web, talking about their slip joints, or Nick's slip joints. In particular, Nick's designs often stood out, Nick of Birdvis, his designs often stood out for mixing a wide range of interesting materials, doing riffs on conventional slip joint patterns, and having extraordinarily precise machining and finishing on knives that, given how incredibly refined and in some ways special they were pretty reasonably priced for a custom knife. You know, these days his knives still retail for $800-900, which is a lot, but that is on the cheaper end of the custom knife spectrum in 2025. Then, I recall it was probably sometime last year, Nick started making these small batch production knives. And this Hitchcock here is the first model. So the Hitchcock is one of Birdvis's signature slip joint designs, with this sheepsfoot blade, this gun stock handle. And the production version carries the same overall shape. He's also got his little pie slice shield here, engraved right into the body, where you normally have, a silver inlaid shield or titanium or something like that. But that overall shape is really where the similarities end. This production Hitchcock is a titanium Framelock with a thumb disc opening, running on bearings, with a pocket clip and a MagnaCut blade. It is, in other words, every bit a modern production folding knife. And this is a production knife. This is made in the United States. Nick has sourced, local manufacturers to put this knife together, but this is a production knife, not a custom, albeit a small batch production knife. This is also a fairly large knife, more than you might expect given the profile and even given what the specs might indicate. You look at the specs on the site, and this, it's a 3-inch blade. And it is, in fact, a 3-inch MagnaCut blade, here with a relatively svelte 130 thousandths blade stock. Not super thin, but not that thick either. You've got a very conventional sheep's foot blade here, with a little swedge toward the front to help thin out that tip and give a little extra visual interest. The body of the knife, 4 3/8 inches long, which doesn't sound that big, but the dimension that matters most is this height. This is a tall, big body that is larger than what you're going to see in most other 3-inch folders. We'll see that in the size comparisons. You combine that with a lack of internal milling on these titanium scales, even though they are relatively thin, and you've got a knife that is decently heavy, or at least not light for the size, coming in at 4.6 ounces for 3 inches of blade. In other words, over 1.5 ounces per inch of blade. This is a small batch production knife. The only places that you can find these, are directly on Birdvis's own site, or occasionally on, other retailers that probably have bought them directly from Nick and are posting them, one by one on their site. Like, I think there's one on Recon One right now. This knife costs $550. They are seemingly built and listed one at a time or very close to it. And they get released in a few different configurations. This is basically the configuration that is most commonly available now, or at least this, sometimes with blasted hardware, sometimes with a satin blade. But this general configuration here with either a blasted or satin blade, and with this satin finish hardware, is your most common configurations. There haven't been any versions that I have seen that have had anything like a different blade shape or different handle materials. It's all pretty much staying within this titanium Framelock format. So to get to a few quick size comparisons, because again, this knife is deceptively large. Here's your PM2, and here is your Para 3. And you can see that even though this knife is quite a bit shorter than the PM2, if you look at the overall amount of space it takes up, it's a pretty big knife. It takes up a lot of space on the table because it is tall, sort of in the same way as the Para 3. It's about the same overall length as the Para 3, and about the same blade, about the same handle, but much like the Para 3, which is kind of notorious for being a big little knife, it is just a little bit tall, a little bit chunky. Now, if you turn it on its side, one thing I want to point out here is the thickness. This is a little bit thinner than, things like your Para 2 or your PM2, your Para 3. Let's bring out your small Sebenza here and your large Sebenza. So right in between those, right in that imaginary medium Sebenza range, you got your 940 here. And where'd my 945 go? There is the 945, so right between those. And then we've got here a TRM Neutron and a TRM Atom. So, very much a mid-size knife, slightly on the smaller end of mid-size, but definitely chunky. It's a little bit heavy, it's a little bit thick, it's a little bit tall, it's a little bit of a larger knife than those specs on paper might indicate. And if you were just looking at the specs of this knife, it doesn't look like a particularly exciting knife. You've got fairly heavy, flat-scaled titanium scales here, with a Framelock on bearings that's not that easy to get and costs more than a Sebenza. That, in fact, sounds a whole lot like the Monterey Bay Knives cane, which was a knife that I reviewed pretty harshly not that long ago. It even had this same sort of finish. But the Birdvis Hitchcock impresses not in anything that's on the spec sheet, but where so many other high-end production knives fall off in the execution. Because really, just about every aspect of this knife is executed at a very, very high level. Let's start with this blade. It is a basic sheep's foot shape, and that's great. Sheep's foot shapes like this are really nice for everyday carry knives. You get a nice long belly, you get a low tip, which is and a low edge, which makes really precise cuts down on a surface cuts, scoring a box, all that sort of stuff. That's all very easy to do with a sheep's foot blade, especially one with all that belly, so it can still do those longer slicing cuts. It's basically a full flat grind, so even though this stock, it's neither too thick or too thin, it's about, 130 thousandths, that's pretty standard middle of the road for the industry. There's basically a full flat grind here, and honestly it looks like the swedge is taken out of the full flat grind, so except for this little flat back here, this is full flat the whole way down. So it does take this decently thick stock down to a decently keen edge. This is not a super duper slicer, this isn't a super sharp knife, but as we'll get to later, the ergonomics and the overall use profile are so good that it ends up being very good at actually cutting stuff. We've all handled sheep's foot blades like this before, and they are very versatile, they're very natural, they perform well at a wide variety of tasks. This one is no exception. The blade here is ground to cut. Basically, if you look at how well, it's not just the edge sharpness, but how well it just gradually comes down from that spine. really, when you pass this through material or when you drag that tip on, trying to cut through a box or trying to, slice through some cardboard or score something or saw through something difficult, it's really the combination of this blade shape, of how nice and even this grind is, and of the fact that, it does come down to a pretty decent cutting edge. This ends up cutting about as well as any small batch production knife I have handled in quite some time. It reminds me sort of how Les George, things coming out of his shop, have that really nice cutting performance despite having some, thicker blade stock, thicker than this one here. It just cuts well. It stays thin all the way across the entire length of the blade. You've got a nice narrow edge bevel here. This is at 17 degrees per side, so it is pretty thin down behind that edge. But really, so much of why it cuts so well. If any of you guys remember Bearded Gear, who used to, do a lot of reviews, hasn't done some in a couple of years, he would talk about how cutting performance is kind of a function of ergonomics as well. So when you've got a really ergonomically nice blade, a really ergonomically nice handle, something that's very natural to hold, you don't notice that resistance as much. And even if the absolute cutting performance isn't quite as keen, if a blade is easier to push through material because it's so nice to hold and handle, it just feels like it's cutting better, even if you're actually exerting more force on it. The Hitchcock here really does feel like that. I did resharpen this knife to try to get a little bit more performance out of it, but frankly, I didn't even in the end, because the other nice thing is the factory edge that this came with is about as good as any, frankly, as any production knife made by anybody other than Spyderco that I've handled in quite some time. So you combine that sheep's foot with that grind and with the ergonomics, which we'll talk about in a second, and this just ends up being a really, really good cutting tool. Whether I'm using it for tasks around the house, whether I'm using it in the garden, scraping through some stuff, dragging it through some stuff, breaking down boxes, this blade has done everything that I need day to day really, really well. It's kind of like what you get out of the PM2 or the Swish Buoy or the Spyderco Native. It's not a laser beam, but it bites consistently at that edge, and it slides easily through whatever you're cutting. So this isn't going to be your grape shaver, but it is going to be something that is very satisfying to use for any of your day-to-day cutting tasks. And the benefit of keeping the blade stock a little bit thicker here is that you get the same kind of feeling that you get with a PM2, where you don't need to worry about babying this knife. You really can push this thing if you want to. And this slightly larger profile that he has gone with here really does lean into this feeling like a beatery knife that can cut. You might not think of a 3-inch knife as falling into that bucket. And I've criticized some knives relatively recently, like the Mariner here, for not being slicey in that small profile. But this is not really trying to be a hyper slicey knife. This is trying to be kind of in that PM2 range, where it's trying to do a bit of everything. And I would say it does it very, very well. It also helps that you've got, I guess it's not shown here, but you do have MagnaCut, which is a nice tough steel, suits that profile very well. The other nice thing about this blade, this little sway that you've got here, put your thumb right there, get right on top of the blade, push through material really, really easily. You can get a ton of control over the blade with this nice little ramp that they've got here. And then if you do need to do some poking, some piercing, this swedge is pretty aggressive, and you can see that tip does get nice and fine. So unlike a lot of sheep's foots, this can do some piercing work if you need to, and it can be very, very precise when you need to use that tip. Honestly, end to end, it's just a simple blade that is executed really, really well. Just a great all-around EDC blade. These days, as I've gotten more discerning with my knives, I often feel the need to carry, 2 knives on any given day, something like that, one for heavier duty, one for lighter duty. This really does slide into that middle ground role where it does everything, the heavier task and the lighter task, as well as I'd need. Not as well as any knife dedicated to either extreme, but it does both ends very, very well. And so this is one of, a handful of knives that I can really just carry this one and feel like I've got everything that I might need that day pretty well handled, as long as I'm not having to do something super duper fine or super duper heavy duty. That overall refinement does extend back to the handle, which, much like the blade, doesn't do anything special, doesn't do anything new, but does everything it tries very well. This handle is a solid hand-filling block of titanium. It's a gun stock design with a nice subtle sweep across the back, completely flat sides, with some nice deep chamfers at the edges, and a blasted stone wash that is very similar to Hinder's working finish in both look and feel. The fit and finish here is excellent. Your screws and hardware are nicely flush with the scales on both sides, except for the clip where they are very, very intentionally inset. You can see, and as you guys have noticed, the degree to which the screws sit flush is a nice proxy to me for sort of the level of detail, the level of just fine-grained attention that has been put into fit and finish. And they're very nice here. The back spacer fits very neatly within the scales here. The blade, very nice and neat in the open position. Very nice and neat in the closed position. All the lines just work very nicely. This thing is always perfectly centered. Everything on this knife is very tight, very clean. It's just done very well. Absolutely no complaints about the fit and finish, albeit with a relatively simple design. Now, ergonomically on this handle, I don't always love gun stock handles. The Jack Wolf Knives Gunslinger Jack. Where is my gunslinger? So the gunslinger and sharpshooter, here we go. I've got one of them. I'll have a review coming up on this gunslinger here. This, sometimes I love it, sometimes I don't. Sometimes some gunslinger designs can be a little too skinny or not have quite enough curve, or basically, they try to have this step and do all the work and end up just not doing quite enough to be really comfortable. This one's better than most because of Jack Wolf. He designs this knife pretty well, but gun stocks can be pretty hit or miss for me. But the Hitchcock, rather than trying to do anything crazy with the design, really just goes for a pretty big, wide handle that is fairly thin. As we showed before, this is, if I bring out our small Sabenza here, this is about the same thickness if you take away the chamfers, maybe just a little bit thicker than a small Sabenza. It's about the same thickness as a large Sabenza, if anything, maybe a smidge thinner. This is on the thinner end of knives, and it's also quite tall. And what that gives you is it gives you a very secure hand-filling grip. Your front two fingers are going to ride pretty naturally in this first section here. Just wrap around it right up next to the blade. And then this back section goes right into the meat of my palm. Some nice flat edges here, nicely rounded and beveled back here, so it does roll into my palm while those flats keep it in place. You got a nice big flat here, so it does feel very locked in. You got a nice grippy texture on the titanium. This feels very secure in the hand. And that is helped by the weight of this handle. This is a handle-heavy knife, which can make it a little bit heavy in the pocket, but also means that you really do feel like you've got control over this whole knife. And it's part of the reason that the cutting performance feels so good, because as this blade cuts through stuff, you've still got most of the weight of the knife in your hand, so you can always really control that blade and that edge. It just feels fantastic in use. There's nothing in here ergonomically that locks your hand in like a Spyderco. There's nothing to stop your hand from coming up onto the blade, so I wouldn't use this for stabbing or poking or anything like that, but you wouldn't really use a sheep's foot for that anyway. What you get here instead is an extremely solid feeling handle that gives you all the control you need for the sorts of tasks you would want for a blade like this. It's not what you use to demo your house But if you're chewing through boxes or cardboard or twine or doing, hacking through the garden or doing anything you might do on a day-to-day basis, this is going to give you enough ergonomic lines and enough cutting performance that it's going to do what you need. But for all that praise, I think actually the most impressive part of this knife, or the part that surprised me the most, was the action. This is as smooth and controlled a bearing action as I have felt in some time. It's the kind of bearing action that it's not super drop shutty and smooth. I'll talk about that lock bar axis in a minute, but it's not drop shutty and smooth like a Grimsmo. This is the kind of bearings action that feels like a perfectly broken in washers action. On the open, you've got a really nice acoustic snap and a really nice sort of tactile snap. This thumb disc here is a custom design. It's this little domed thumb disc that I've never seen on any other knife. It's not a simple knurled disc. It's actually a machined piece of titanium with that single row of knurling there on the side. It's perfectly placed to catch your thumb. Very natural. Your thumb falls right there. Gives you just enough grip without chewing up your skin. And while the detent is on the lighter side of medium, the bearings are so smooth that it will snap out reliably every single time with a crisp and satisfying pop. And if you want to slow roll this, it works just fine for that. On the close, it's smooth and consistent. It's not really drop shut or shake shut, but it is fold shut and it is smooth the whole way there. Again, this bearings action feels like a very nicely tuned washer action. It's got that glassy feel you get on like Spyderco's Swish knives, the Swish Bowie, the Techno, the Swayback, things like that. It feels very much like that. There's no friction. It's just nice and controlled through the opening and closing. It's not a fast action. So if you're looking for that, you might be disappointed, but I find it very satisfying. The other thing that I really like, this is one of my little pet peeves, but if you look here, Nick has recessed the bearing pockets properly, so there is very little clearance between the blade and the scales. I love that. It's a little bit of extra detail. It makes the whole knife just feel a little bit tighter. And it's the kind of thing you might expect from a slip joint maker. The sort of thing that I don't love that Jack Wolf knives didn't do that. If you look at, say, the gaps here, this is what happens when you don't recess the bearings quite enough into the handles. And it just, there's nothing functional. There's no functional issue about this, but it just doesn't look quite as tight. It's done very nicely here. And so overall, this is a fantastic action. Completely smooth, completely consistent, completely satisfying. And for somebody who makes slip joints, Nick sure nailed how to make a frame lock. The one quibble with this knife, which you've seen me struggle with a bit already, is probably this lock bar axis, which is not great. You can see you've got two parallel scales, no cutout on the front scale, and just this one little chamfer here, not even a chamfer on this other side. And you've got pretty strong lock bar pressure here. So given how thin that gap is, you really got to jam your thumb in there and then push it, because it's not a late lockup, but it's not early either. You got to really deliberately push that over. It's something you do get used to after a bit, but there are definitely some folks that are going to find that difficult to work with. I could see some people that get these doing like people did with their Gale Bradleys and milling out a little bit of lock bar access on the show side here. It's just, it really could be better, whether that's milling out more space on the lock bar or just putting a little bit of a cutout here, probably milling more space on the lock bar, kind of like Jack Wolf does to bring that in again. That would increase the access there. I wouldn't be surprised if that gets added over time. But that is really my only functional complaint, or frankly, my only complaint of any sort about this knife. And so at $550, because let's get to that price, it is absolutely an expensive knife, but to the extent that any knife is worth that price, I can see it here. If you're into this design, then you're going to be able to justify the price here, as long as you play in that range. I'm going to bring a couple reference points here, because this is not an unusual price point for American-made small batch production. We're talking a similar price point to most of your McNeese knives these days. We're talking just a little bit more expensive than things like the Les George Talos. And this is a knife that is, maybe a little bit more expensive than the Talos and maybe a little bit more expensive than sort of a plain Jane McNeese like this. But it's also made in smaller numbers than either of those. And it is made very much to the same level of quality, very much to the same standard. The scale that Birdvis is making knives at isn't where Les George is now or where McNeese is now. It's where they were a few years ago, when you would get random drops on their website and they would post 5 knives and they would go in 10 seconds. These aren't selling out immediately like those did, but when we say small batch, we're talking like batches of single-digit numbers of knives, not big retail drops like you're getting these days with McNeese, which, great for him, and I'll review this knife later. It's a great knife. This is a custom maker who is making his first production knife, and I wouldn't be surprised if there was a decent bit of handwork to get everything so perfectly tight and smooth. And most importantly, this knife just works really well with the same kind of commitment to executing the very simple things very right that reminds me a lot of Les George. And frankly, reminds me a little bit of McNeese, where, these are all knives that really just are going to take an idea of what this sort of knife should be and just execute it at a very, very high level. And frankly, the level of tightness on display here, I would say, and the level of overall refinement is, if anything, maybe a teensy step higher on the Hitchcock than on either of these other knives. It's trying to be a different sort of knife, but I would say if you had to ask me what is the tightest fit and finishing of those 3 knives I just had, I would say it was probably the Birdvis. Only by a hair, but it is by a hair. This is a very, very good knife. And while the style isn't for everybody, it is incredibly exciting for the first locking knife from such a well-known custom maker to be this good. And, he's only made dozens of these so far, so it's only going to be better over time. I'm going to end with a little side note, a little digression. There was a thread I was reading a couple weeks ago. I think it was on Reddit, but it might have been a YouTube comment or on Blade forums. That was talking about the 2 rough categories of American semi-production knife makers. And I should say North American, because, you can throw Grimsmo in here and stuff like that too. On one hand, you've got the makers actually, I'll bring out a tactile here as a perfect example. On one hand, you've got makers like Birdvis and like John McNeese, who started as custom makers, these guys, and then after the demand for their knives exceeded what they could make as custom makers, they started making production knives. And then on the other hand, you've got places like Tactile Knives, which is also the same as places like Grimsmo or Oz Machine Co. or Montana Knife Company, and even places, makers like Brown Knives and Machine Wise, that started as machinists and then saw knives as a place to apply their really high-level machining skills. And, what you see out of this category here, which, this is your McNeese, this is your Les George, this is David Ridbaum over at Kingdom Armory when he did some production stuff. This is John Gonzalez of Dervish Knives. This is John Gray, and this is even, many, many moons ago, Chris Reeve. What you see in those makers is the level of tolerance, the level of precision, the level of sort of execution of their vision that they shoot for and they tolerate. Nothing against these machinist first makers like Tactile, but, there's a sense and there's a reality that they live in a world of numbers and tolerances. They can make a great, often excellent product by making things tighter and more precisely to spec. But for the latter group, for these knives, for these makers that were custom makers first, before getting into production work, they often have first-hand experience with the kind of insane fit and finish and feel that you can get from a custom maker who isn't just willing to, make it good on paper, but really feels like they are obligated to slave over every facet of the knife until the feel precisely manages what they're going for, until the look is flawless. That is where they started. That is what a custom knife maker's customers expect. They're used to work that may not be quite as consistent and certainly isn't nearly as scalable, but it does bring that kind of that feeling of things being just the way they're supposed to be that you get from a really nice custom knife. They try to bring that into their production knives. And so when these guys, and again, I'll bring Les out here again too, when these guys start from that baseline and their production knife, and then they try to go into production, their production often looks and feels like their damnedest effort to try to make something that comes as close to that ideal as they possibly can. Birdvis feels squarely in the same camp as these other makers that I have on the table here, while coming in at a price point that is fully competitive with what those makers are putting out. The Birdvis Hitchcock looks, feels, and handles like a production knife that is trying to meet that high bar set by custom knives. And it just feels more just tight and refined and just useful than some of those more distant, overtly mechanical knives that you can get from those really good machinists, but it's still, a machined product first. And this is a production knife. I'm not saying that this is a custom knife. I'm saying there is that little bit of extra care, that little bit of extra fit and finish, just that little extra feeling of going one step further to make it really, really good. As Nick's first modern locking folder, it is a phenomenal starting point. From a use perspective, from a visual perspective, from a fit and finish perspective, it's just fantastic. And I think as people get more of these into their hands, I would not be surprised if these Hitchcock production knives and whatever production knives that Nick comes out with next end up attracting the same hype that his slip joints have for the next few years. Stellar work, highly recommended. This has been Clark the Knife, and I will see you on the next one.